Talk to us a little bit about these polls. What's behind it? Give us a sense of what we should pay attention to and what we should just leave alone.
Yeah, leaving it all alone might be the healthiest approach to it now. We call it the polar coaster now. I think it's the best description of what we're all riding on. That you do not have to get on the polar coaster. To be clear, though a lot of us are addicted to it. Just this week, we saw that poll, that
Hmm.
great Quinnipiac poll, showing President Biden with a 6 point lead, which,
Hmm.
sort of like would suggest that sanity has been restored in this country. But then at the same time, we saw another series of polls released this week that showed Donald Trump sweeping through the battleground states with a lead in every battleground state. And some numbers that just weren't plausible, winning in North Carolina by double digits, things like that. So what's happening? It's
Hmm.
not news to say that polling as an industry is deeply troubled. There are a
Hmm.
lot of bad polls out there. We all experience this, and our collective friend who you've had on here multiple times, Simon Rosenburg, did a
Hmm.
great job. And I appreciate y'all giving him that platform to do this here in sounding the alarm in 2022 that our general sense that this red wave was coming in 2022 was based on a lot of bad polls. Well, the bad
Hmm.
news is the bad polls haven't gone away.
Hmm.
The other reality that we all just have to accept, I think, is this is likely to be a very close election, and we don't know who's going to turn out. There are a lot of voters who are going to need a little love and attention to be turned out and to vote Democrat in this election. And those polls are reflecting that reality, meaning every pollster has their own sense. When they build a poll sample, a likely voter sample, they're all making somewhat educated guesses about who's going to vote. And so that explains generally why you might see one poll that shows things looking really bad for us
Hmm.
and one that shows things looking really good, is because they're two different. Think about it as a choose your own adventure. One is the Quinnipiac poll, to me, is if we do the work, we get our voters out, we communicate as we can, and we have, then we'll win. And we could win by big margins. If we don't do that work, if we allow Donald Trump to continue to manipulate the media and the American electorate as he has in the past, he could win.
Hey, let's talk about Iowa too, because we watch that and tend to think that Trump is doing really fantastic. But if you get under the numbers, it looks a little different, right?
Yeah, it's a little bizarre to me in terms of the how this has been generally reported in mainstream media, where the Iowa caucuses, again, only Republicans had their caucuses there. Democrats have changed the schedule. And what we saw was President Trump getting 50% of the vote, which is not a strong performance in Iowa. Generally, when you think about that caucus, you think about who goes out to vote, and especially then, it was, bitterly cold weather. You're only getting the most hardcore party activists. The fact that he did not break 50%, to me was a sign of um his coalition showing some cracks in the Republican
Hmm.
Party. There is a critical mass of Republicans who want someone else. New Hampshire, to me, was an even more striking sign because you had by then Ron DeSantis famously and quite
Hmm.
embarrassingly dropped out. He was trying to spare himself the embarrassment of winning, 2 or 3% of the vote as he was on track to do. I think he's trying to preserve some ability to run in 4 years, but I think we've seen who he actually is now. I'll
Yeah.
be surprised if he has much staying power. But what we saw was Nikki Haley pulling together more of a anti-MAGA coalition. And it's not like, let's be real, Nikki Haley is the perfect standard bearer for anti-Trumpism. In fact, until about a week before the election, she was doing what everyone else in the Republican primary field was doing, which was going out of her way to not say negative things about him.
Hmm.
She finally opened up, talked about his mental acuity and the reality there. Um, and she held him to a very close margin. Again, I think the final margin was about 10 or 11 points. For someone who is effectively running as an incumbent, as Donald Trump is, for
Hmm.
him to go into New Hampshire and fail to win by a wider margin, again, is a sign of weakness, this campaign. It's a sign that there are a lot of Republicans who are not happy with him as their standard bearer. Now, whether or not that turns into those voters crossing over when the choice is between Trump and President Biden, I don't know. Some of them will. Question is how many will. Some of
Hmm.
them will stay home. So a lot
Hmm.
of Republicans are sick of what Donald Trump has done to his party because, to be clear, he is the biggest loser, if I can borrow a term from TV, and that what he's done to the party is they've just done nothing but lose since he entered the scene. And so I think you're seeing that these early states, he's going to win. He's going to be the nominee. He will get through this, but he will be weakened from the process. And I think that's important.
Yeah. Before we go into Wisconsin, because I really do want to talk about Wisconsin, because there's some really important lessons that we can all use and sort of put into place. So let's talk about Wisconsin. What happened in Wisconsin and what are the lessons?
Well, Wisconsin, there have been a few elections in basically since the Dobbs decision. If I can go way back to 2022, and we've talked
Hmm.
about this on this show a couple of times. I've been thankful for the opportunity to join y'all. But the big question has been, what does this post Dobbs electorate look like? How has Dobbs changed the landscape? And so what we saw, the big thing to me, the most notable thing was the Supreme Court race there. We also have to talk about Pennsylvania, where they had their Supreme Court race last November. And Wisconsin elections are always close, right? You look at presidential elections for the last 20 years there, the margin has been, I think the average margin is something like less than 2 points. It's always close. And that Supreme Court race where the Democrat slash progressive candidate won, they won by, gosh, I think it was, someone can correct me on this in the chat, but I want to say it was around 7 or 8 points. Um, and then now what we're having happen there, because Republicans successfully gerrymandered that state, probably more successfully than any other state. They took control in 2014. Scott Walker came in, they won the legislature narrowly, and then they changed all the rules, trying to make it a permanent Republican majority. Well, now the court decision there has overturned that gerrymander. So you'll actually have fair maps in Wisconsin this year for the first time, and Democrats will have an opportunity to retake that legislature. So I think what you're going to see is fired up Democrats and progressives going into November, where they actually see that they have a chance for electing candidates of their choice, which hasn't happened in 10 years in that state.
Wow, that's going to be pretty amazing. I do want to have a chance to talk a little bit about absentee ballots because that was sort of a thing in terms of how Republicans did, how Democrats did. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about what that looked like and what we
Yes.
should expect about absentee ballots.
One thing that we learned a lot from in the elections last year that I think we have to pay a little bit of attention to nationally, in that we've had this trajectory where for the longest time, Republicans got their supporters out voting by mail. They had a big advantage around the country in this. It was a big strategic and tactical advantage. Donald Trump in 2020 gave us this wonderful gift where he convinced his supporters that voting by mail was fraud. And what we saw was things just turned on their heads, where in many states, the mail voting was 3-1 Democrat. And to be clear, our organizers around the country did an incredible job getting people out to vote, curing ballots, making sure that the votes counted. Places like Pennsylvania, they heard about the naked ballot, where if you didn't sign it in the right place, the vote would be invalidated. And our team did a great job getting the word out, and that was a key element to our success. Virginia last year was really the first test of where Republicans were actually going to try to turn the tide. And we saw
Mhm.
Republicans under Governor Youngkin invest millions of dollars in getting their people out to vote by mail. And they did have some success in that,
Mhm.
frankly. And we saw, of course, as we all know, as you've talked about a bunch here, when you look at, obviously the end result in the state legislature is incredibly close, but uh, the closest races, we had a few that we left on the table.
Mhm.
Republicans won basically everything they possibly could won. And I think their vote by mail plan was a big part of that. And again, a lot of work I know by a lot of people on this show and people viewing to make sure that it wasn't worse than it could have been, and it allowed us to take back control of the legislature. But going into this year, we just have to accept that vote by mail is going to be a bigger battle. We need to invest more in it. We need to do more to convince people to make sure that if there are problems with their ballot, that we are curing those ballots, because we did have some issues with that, I know, in Virginia.
Mhm.
Um, that needs to be a focus. So I think it'll potentially be even bigger than it was in 2020, believe it or not.
Yeah.